The ostrich feather fan, dyed a poison green to match her gown, snapped in Eleanor Vancourt's glove hand the moment she heard his laugh cut through the orchestra's waltz. The sound traveled up from the ballroom floor below, through the chatter of 300 guests, past the crystal chandeliers dripping with candlelight, and straight into the velvet-draped box where Eleanor sat with her fiancé. It wasn't a loud laugh. It was something worse. It was familiar. Eleanor pressed the broken fan against her palm and pretended nothing had happened. Beside her, Reginald Astia Finch droned on about railroad investments and the rising cost of maintaining his country estate. She nodded at the appropriate moments, the way she'd been trained since birth. A Vancourt never shows weakness. A Vancourt never breaks character. A Vancourt certainly never drops a $200 fan in public. But Eleanor Vancourt, at 22 years old, had spent her entire life being exactly what everyone expected. The newspapers called her the Sunshine Heiress because her smile never faltered, because she donated to children's hospitals with photographers present, because her blonde curls and pink cheeks made her look like she'd stepped out of a storybook. Her father, Theodore Vancourt, owned half the textile mills in New York State. Her mother, Clarice, had been a society belle before marriage made her a society matron. Eleanor's path was paved in silk and sealed with a diamond ring from Reginald, whose family money went back far enough that no one asked where it came from. The year was 1926. The place was the Starlight Ballroom on Fifth Avenue. The occasion was the annual charity gala for the New York Children's Hospital, which meant every important family in the city had shown up to be seen doing good. Eleanor lifted her champagne glass and scanned the crowd below. Men in tailcoats. Women in beadwork and feathers. The orchestra, positioned near the grand staircase, played something slow and safe. Everything was exactly as it should be. Then she saw him. Liam Blackwood stood near the punch bowl, looking profoundly out of place. His tuxedo was new. She could tell by the way the shoulders sat slightly wrong, but it had cost someone a great deal of money. He held a glass of water, not champagne, and he was watching the dancers with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read. Interest? Judgment? Both. 6 months earlier, she'd met him at a speakeasy on Mulberry Street. She'd gone there with college friends, slumming it for an evening, drinking something illegal out of a teacup and feeling wonderfully dangerous. He'd been tending bar, not because he needed the money but because, he'd told her, he wanted to understand how the other half lived. They'd talked for 2 hours about art and music and the novels she wasn't supposed to read. He'd made her laugh until her stomach hurt. She'd given him a fake name and never expected to see him again. Now here he was, at her ballroom, in her world, wearing a suit he couldn't possibly afford. Reginald followed her gaze. "Who's that?" he asked, his voice carrying that particular edge he used for anyone who didn't belong. "I don't know," Eleanor lied. "Looks like a gatecrasher. Someone should have a word with security." Reginald straightened his bow tie. He had a habit of straightening things when he felt threatened, even though nothing about Liam Blackwood should have threatened a man like Reginald Astia Finch. Eleanor should have let it go. She should have smiled, agreed, and let security handle the problem quietly. That's what the old Eleanor would have done. But the champagne had loosened something in her chest, and the memory of that night on Mulberry Street warmed her more than the central heating, and Reginald's voice grated like fingernails on a chalkboard. "Watch this," she said. Reginald's hand caught her wrist. "Eleanor, don't make a scene." She pulled free. "I never make scenes. I am the entertainment." The walk down the grand staircase took 47 seconds. Eleanor counted. Her mother had taught her to count during public appearances. It helped maintain the correct pace, the correct posture, the correct smile. By the time she reached the bottom, 47 seconds had passed and at least a dozen people had commented on how lovely she looked. Liam saw her coming. He didn't pretend otherwise. His eyes tracked her across the marble floor, and when she stopped in front of him, he smiled like they'd planned this meeting. "Miss Vancourt," he said. "Or should I say Miss Fake Name Who Talks Too Much About Books?" Eleanor felt heat climb her neck. "You shouldn't be here." The invitation said Charity Gala. "I'm charitably inclined." He raised his water glass. "Also, I bought a bond. Does that count?" It did count. Charity bonds cost $500 each. He'd spent $500 to stand by a punch bowl and watch her dance with other men. The thought made her chest feel strange. "You're a bartender," she said. "I'm many things." Reginald appeared at her elbow, solid and predictable. "Is this gentleman bothering you, darling?" The word darling landed wrong. It always landed wrong, but Eleanor had learned to ignore it. Tonight, with Liam watching, it landed like a stone in shallow water. "Not at all," Eleanor said. "We were just discussing charity bonds." Reginald looked Liam up and down. "How many did you purchase?" "One." "One." Reginald repeated the word like it was a dead insect. "How generous of you." "I purchased 20. For the children, of course." Liam's smile didn't waver. "Of course." Something sparked in Eleanor's chest. Maybe it was the champagne. Maybe it was the way Liam stood his ground against a man who could crush him with a phone call. Maybe it was the memory of 6 months ago, when she'd been just a girl in a speakeasy and he'd treated her like a person instead of an heiress. "I'll make you a bet," Eleanor heard herself say. Both men turned to look at her. "The next dance is a waltz." She pointed toward the orchestra. "If you lead me through it properly, I'll give you one of my father's company bonds. They're worth 10 times what you paid for that charity ticket." Reginald's face went pale. "Eleanor, that's absurd." She ignored him. "If you stumble, if you step on my dress, if you make one single mistake, you leave quietly and never speak of knowing me. Deal?" Liam studied her for a long moment. The orchestra tuned their instruments. A woman in yellow shoes walked past, laughing at something her companion said. The chandeliers swayed slightly as a door opened somewhere, letting in cold November air. "You don't think I can dance," Liam said. "I think you're out of your depth." He set down his water glass. "I've been out of my depth since I met you." The orchestra struck the first chord of the waltz. It hit Eleanor like a physical thing, vibrating through the marble floor, up through her satin shoes, into her bones. Liam held out his hand. His palm, when she placed her gloved fingers against it, was rough with calluses that made no sense for a bartender. The music swelled, and Eleanor Vancourt, the sunshine heiress, stepped into a dance that would cost her everything. The moment Liam Blackwood's hand settled on Eleanor's waist, she knew she had made a terrible mistake. His palm pressed against the silk of her gown with the confidence of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. His other hand held hers at the perfect height, neither too high nor too low, and his shoulders sat back like he owned the floor beneath them. This was not the stance of a bartender who'd bought a cheap suit and talk his way into a ballroom. This was the stance of someone who had learned to dance before he learned to walk. The waltz swept through the starlight ballroom like a living thing. Violins first, then cellos, then the warm pulse of French horns. 300 guests turned to watch as the sunshine heiress took the floor with a man no one recognized. Eleanor felt their eyes on her skin like physical weight. Liam moved forward. She moved back. It happened without thought, without effort, like her body had been waiting its whole life for someone to lead like this. Her feet found the steps without consulting her brain. The poison green gown swirled around her ankles. "You're staring," Liam said quietly. Eleanor realized her mouth had fallen slightly open. She closed it. "I'm trying to anticipate your next mistake. You'll be waiting a long time." He turned her, sharp and clean, and suddenly they were facing the opposite direction. Eleanor caught a glimpse of Reginald by the punch bowl. His face had gone the color of old milk. Behind him, near the grand staircase, 2 men in dark suits watched with expressions that made her stomach drop. She recognized them. They worked for her father. They were always watching, always taking notes, always reporting back. She stumbled. Liam caught her instantly, his arms solid around her waist, pulling her close enough that her chest brushed against his jacket. "Careful," he murmured. "Wouldn't want to lose that bond." "I haven't lost anything yet." "Haven't you?" The music swelled again. Liam guided her into a series of turns that left Eleanor breathless. The ballroom blurred around her, crystal chandeliers becoming streaks of light, velvet drapes becoming smears of burgundy, the watching crowd becoming a single living thing with 300 pairs of eyes. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Sweat gathered at the back of her neck, beneath her carefully pinned curls. She had danced with Reginald 100 times. Reginald danced like he was following instructions from a book. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, never a hair out of place, never a moment of surprise. Liam danced like the music was a conversation and he knew exactly what to say next. "You learned this somewhere," Eleanor managed. "Where?" "My mother taught me." He turned her again. She was a dancer. Not the kind they write about in society pages. The kind who performed in music halls for pennies until her feet bled. Eleanor tried to picture it. A music hall mother. A childhood nothing like her own. "Is that why you came tonight? To prove something?" Liam smiled, but his eyes stayed serious. "I came because someone told me the Sunshine Heiress was the most boring person in New York. I wanted to see if it was true." "And?" "You're not boring." He dipped her suddenly, dangerously, and Eleanor's hand nearly brushed the marble floor. "You're just trapped." The music reached its highest point. All around them, other couples had stopped dancing to watch. Eleanor saw faces she'd known her whole life, women she'd gone to school with, men who'd courted her before Reginald, matrons who'd watched her grow up. They stared like she'd grown a second head. Liam pulled her up. The dip had pressed them close together, closer than was proper, closer than her mother would ever allow. Eleanor could smell him now, something clean and simple, nothing like the expensive cologne Reginald wore. Soap. Paper. A hint of something sharp, like ink. "You have ink on your hands," she said. "I work with my hands." "You tend bar." Liam's grip tightened slightly on her waist. The waltz was building toward its final chorus. "I told you. I'm many things." The last chord crashed through the ballroom. Liam held Eleanor in the final position, her hand extended, his other hand firm on her back, their faces inches apart. For one perfect second, the world stopped. No music. No chatter. No clinking glasses. Just Eleanor and this stranger who danced like her dreams. Then the applause began. It started small, near the orchestra, and spread outward like ripples in a pond. People were clapping. Actually clapping. For them. For the dance. Eleanor blinked, disoriented, and realized her cheeks hurt from smiling. Liam released her slowly. He stepped back, bowed like a gentleman from another century, and when he straightened, his eyes found hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "The bond is mine, Miss Vancourt." He turned and walked away before she could respond. The crowd parted for him like he had every right to be there. Eleanor stood frozen in the center of the ballroom floor, her chest heaving, her hair coming loose from its pins, her heart doing something she couldn't name. Then she saw them again. Her father's men. They had moved from the staircase to the edge of the floor. One of them held a small notebook. The other was watching Liam's retreating back with an expression Eleanor recognized from years of boardroom dinners. It was the look of men who had just found exactly what they were looking for. Eleanor's stomach dropped through the floor. She looked at Liam, disappearing into the crowd. She looked at her father's men, already moving to follow. And in that moment, with the applause still ringing in her ears and the heat of his hand still burning through her dress, she understood. This was never about her. Liam Blackwood hadn't come for the dance. He hadn't come for the champagne or the crowd or the chance to prove himself. He had come for the bond. The Vancourt Company bond she'd so carelessly offered. A single piece of paper worth $10,000, and more importantly, a single piece of paper that would let its holder walk through doors that had been closed to everyone named Blackwood for generations. The ballroom felt suddenly cold. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself and realized she was trembling. Not from the dance. From the weight of what she'd done. Behind her, Reginald's voice cut through the fog. "Eleanor, what in God's name was that?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Because the truth was just now dawning on her, bright and terrible as morning light. That laugh she'd heard from the balcony. That familiar sound that had made her snap her fan in two. It wasn't familiar because she'd heard it at a speakeasy 6 months ago. It was familiar because she'd heard it her whole life. Liam Blackwood laughed like her father. 6 months after the waltz that changed everything, Eleanor Vancourt stood in a cramped kitchen on the Lower East Side and watched a cockroach crawl across the chipped enamel sink. October 1926 had brought early frost to New York. Through the single window above the sink, Eleanor could see her breath mist in the cold air. The landlord had promised coal for the stove by November. She didn't believe him. She'd stopped believing anyone who made promises. The mirror above the sink was cracked diagonally from corner to corner. Eleanor caught her reflection in it every morning, whether she wanted to or not. Today, she wanted to look away. She didn't. The face staring back belonged to a stranger. Pale skin where there used to be pink cheeks. Dark circles where there used to be sparkle. Nails bitten to the quick, fingers stained from cheap ink and cheaper paper. Her hair, once her mother's pride, hung in limp strands around her face. She'd sold her curling iron 3 weeks ago for grocery money. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Eleanor tensed, listening. The footsteps passed her door and continued up the stairs. She exhaled. 6 months. 6 months since the Starlight Ballroom. 6 months since she'd handed Liam Blackwood a Vancourt company bond and watched her life collapse like a house of cards in the wind. The newspapers had been merciless. Sunshine Heiress's reckless bet ruins family. Vancourt fortune lost in one dance. The waltz that wiped out millions. They left out the important parts. They didn't mention that her father's mills had been bleeding money for years. They didn't mention that Liam hadn't just taken the bond. He'd used it to buy voting shares, to call in favors, to pull on threads that unraveled everything Theodore Vancourt had built over 40 years. They didn't mention that Liam Blackwood's father had died in one of those mills, crushed by a loom her father refused to replace. Eleanor had learned that part later. Much later. After the lawsuits and the bankruptcies and the day her mother locked herself in her bedroom and refused to come out. After Reginald's engagement announcement appeared in the Times, to a girl from Boston with money that hadn't been touched by scandal. After Eleanor packed one suitcase and took the elevated train downtown with no idea where she'd sleep. She'd learned it from a woman at the laundry where she now took other people's clothes. The woman's name was Maria. She'd worked in the Vancourt mills for 12 years. Her husband had worked beside Liam Blackwood's father. When Eleanor mentioned the name, Maria had crossed herself and said, "That family paid for your dresses with their blood." Eleanor had vomited in the alley behind the laundry. Now she stood in her kitchen, 6 months later, and tried to remember who she'd been before. That girl in the poison green gown seemed like a character from a book. Someone else's story. Someone else's mistakes. A knock at the door made her jump. Eleanor didn't move. Visitors never meant good news. Visitors meant bills she couldn't pay or reporters hoping for one last interview or her mother's lawyer with more papers to sign. The knock came again. Harder. Miss Vancourt. A man's voice. Low. Familiar in ways that made her chest tighten. "I know you're in there. Open the door." Liam. Eleanor's hands gripped the edge of the sink. The cockroach had disappeared into a crack in the wall. She envied it. Miss Vancourt. She walked to the door on legs that didn't feel like her own. Her hand trembled as she turned the deadbolt. The door swung open, and there he stood. Liam Blackwood looked nothing like the man who danced with her at the Starlight Ballroom. His suit was the same one. She recognized the slightly off shoulders, but now it hung loose on his frame. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. His collar was wrinkled. He held a stack of papers in one hand, and his fingers were stained with the same ink she'd noticed 6 months ago. "You look terrible," Eleanor said. "You look like you live in a tenement." "I do live in a tenement." Liam's jaw tightened. "Can I come in?" Eleanor stepped aside. He walked past her into the tiny kitchen, looking around at the cracked walls, the single chair, the bed visible through the open bedroom door. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "I brought documents," he said. holding out the papers. Your father's bankruptcy is final. The company has been dissolved and sold. These are the last forms. Sign them, and you walk away with nothing. But you walk away clean. Eleanor took the papers. Her hands were steady now. Funny how ruin steadied a person. And if I don't sign, then I make sure every newspaper from here to Chicago runs the full story. The ballroom bet. The bond. The heiress who destroyed her own family for a dance with a stranger. Liam met her eyes. You'll be a cautionary tale for the next 100 years. The weight of those words hung in the cold air between them. Eleanor looked down at the papers. A small stipend waited at the bottom, buried in legal language. Enough to survive. Not enough to matter. She reached for the pen on her windowsill. Her fingers touched it, ready to sign away the last piece of her old life. Then she looked at Liam's hands. They were wrapped around the stack of remaining documents, holding them steady. And in the weak October light, Eleanor saw them clearly for the first time. Not just ink stains. Not just calluses. Scars. Thick white scars across his knuckles. Swollen joints that spoke of old breaks badly healed. And around his fingernails, that dark stain, not just ink, but something ground deeper into the skin. Something that wouldn't wash out. Printer's ink went away with soap and water. This stain had been there for years. Eleanor's breath caught. She looked up at his face, really looked, and saw the pieces click into place like a lock opening. Music hall mother, he'd said. She'd imagined glitter and feathers and applause. But music halls didn't put scars on knuckles. Music halls didn't grind ink into skin. Your mother, Eleanor said slowly. She wasn't a dancer, was she? Liam's face went still. She worked in the mills. Eleanor's voice barely rose above a whisper. Both your parents. They worked for my father. Your father died there. And you, she looked at his hands again. You didn't learn to dance in a ballroom. You learned in union halls, organizing meetings, places where workers planned how to fight back. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled tight. Liam set the papers down on the chipped enamel sink. When he spoke, his voice was rough. My mother scrubbed floors in that mill for 14 years. My father operated a loom for 20. He was 3 months from retirement when the machine broke and your father refused to fix it. It crushed him. Took 4 hours for anyone to find his body. Eleanor's legs gave out. She sank onto the single chair, her hands gripping the wooden arms. I didn't know. No, you didn't. You never knew anything about where your money came from. Liam picked up the papers again. Sign these, Miss Vancourt. Take the stipend. Move somewhere warm. Forget any of this happened. And then what? You go back to. What? Running unions? Printing pamphlets? Liam didn't answer. Eleanor looked at the scars on his hands, at the ink beneath his nails, at the exhaustion in his eyes that matched her own. And in that moment, with the cold October air seeping through the window and the cockroach watching from the crack in the wall, Eleanor realized something that shattered the last piece of who she used to be. She had spent 6 months believing she was the victim, the innocent heiress destroyed by a scheming stranger. But Liam Blackwood wasn't a stranger. He was the son of people her family had used and discarded. He'd lost his father to her father's greed. He'd grown up with nothing while she'd grown up with everything. And every penny of that everything had been paid by people like his parents. The story she told herself, that she was blameless, that she was collateral damage in someone else's revenge, crumbled like old newspaper. Eleanor looked up at Liam. You didn't do this for money. I did it for my mother. She died last year. Never had a dollar to her name. Then why offer me a stipend? Why not let me starve? Liam held her gaze for a long moment. Because I looked in your eyes on that dance floor and saw someone who didn't know. That's not the same as being guilty. But it's not the same as innocent either. He turned toward the door. Sign the papers. Mail them to the address on the first page. I won't bother you again. The door clicked shut behind him. Eleanor sat alone in the cold kitchen, the papers in her lap, and for the first time in her life, she saw herself clearly. Not the sunshine heiress. Not the victim. Just a girl who'd lived on stolen light while others worked in shadows. January 1927 brought the coldest winter New York had seen in 20 years. Snow piled in grey mountains on street corners. Ice coated the elevated train tracks so thickly that service stopped for 3 days. People burned furniture to stay warm. Eleanor Vancourt burned her old society pages. Page by page, she fed them into the tiny stove in her kitchen. Debutante announcements. Charity ball photographs. Engagement notices. The faces of people she'd known her whole life curled and blackened and turned to ash. The heat barely touched the cold seeping through the walls. She hadn't signed the papers. They sat on her windowsill, weighted down by a stone she'd found in the street. Every morning she looked at them. Every morning she walked past them to the laundry, where she spent 10 hours pressing other people's shirts for $7 a week. But something had changed inside Eleanor since Liam walked out her door. The girl who'd sat frozen in that chair, watching her reflection in a cracked mirror, had started to ask questions. Not about Liam. About herself. What did she actually know? What had she ever bothered to learn? The answers kept her awake at night. So she started going to libraries. Not the fancy ones uptown, where the librarians would recognize her name and whisper behind their hands. The small branch on Rivington Street, where no one cared who your father was. She read old newspaper articles about the mill strikes of 1912. She read reports from factory inspections that made her stomach turn. She read names. Hundreds of names. Workers who'd died. Workers who'd been injured. Workers who'd tried to organize and been fired for their trouble. Liam Blackwood's father was in those reports. Patrick Blackwood. Died April 3, 1913. Crushed by a loom. The report noted that the safety guard had been removed 6 months earlier to increase production speed. No one was held responsible. Eleanor copied the report by hand. Her fingers cramped. Her eyes burned. She kept going. After the library, she found the women. Maria from the laundry introduced her to others. Widows whose husbands had died in the mills. Daughters who'd worked beside their mothers since age 12. They met in kitchens and church basements, drinking tea from crack cups, sharing stories that made Eleanor want to scream. They didn't scream. They talked. They planned. They organized. And slowly, piece by piece, Eleanor started to understand what Liam had been doing all along. He wasn't just getting revenge on one family. He was building something. A network. A voice. A way for these stories to reach people who'd never bothered to listen. The second week of January, Eleanor found his print shop. It was hidden on a side street near the waterfront, sandwiched between a fish market and a boarded-up tenement. The sign above the door said Blackwood Printing in faded letters. Light glowed through the frosted windows. Eleanor stood across the street for 20 minutes before she worked up the courage to cross. The door opened before she reached it. Liam stood in the doorway, sleeves rolled up, hands black with ink, looking exactly like a man who'd been expecting bad news. "You found me," he said. "I'm not here to cause trouble." "Then why are you here?" Eleanor reached into her coat and pulled out the stack of papers she'd been carrying for weeks. Testimonies. Report copies. Names and dates and places. She held them out to him. "I want to help." Liam looked at the papers. Then at her face. Then at the papers again. "You want to help." "I've spent 3 months talking to women who worked for my father. They told me things I didn't want to hear. I wrote them down." She pushed the stack closer. "You're the only person in this city who can print the truth. So print it. Use my name. Use my face. I don't care anymore." Liam took the papers. He read the first page. Then the second. When he looked up, something in his expression had shifted. "These women trusted you." "They trusted me because I stopped lying about who I am." Eleanor met his eyes. "I'm my father's daughter. I spent 22 years spending money that came from their suffering. I can't change that. But I can make sure everyone knows it happened. And I can make sure it stops happening. The wind picked up, driving snow against their faces. Liam stepped aside and gestured her inside. The print shop was small and warm and smelled of ink and metal. A printing press dominated the center of the room, its parts scattered across a work table. Pamphlets were stacked everywhere, on shelves, on chairs, on the floor. Eleanor picked one up. Workers' rights and you. Another. The mill owner's secret profits. You've been busy, she said. Someone has to be. Liam set her papers on the table. Eleanor, do you understand what you're offering? If we publish these names, these stories, your family will never recover. Whatever's left of the Vancourt name will be destroyed. The Vancourt name deserves to be destroyed. And you? What do you deserve? Eleanor thought about it. Really thought about it. The way she'd been thinking about everything lately. I deserve to spend the rest of my life trying to fix what I didn't know was broken. That's not punishment. That's purpose. Liam stared at her for a long moment. Then he laughed. Not the laugh from the ballroom, that sharp, cutting sound. Something different. Something almost warm. You're nothing like I expected, he said. You expected the sunshine heiress. I expected someone who'd run back uptown the moment things got hard. He gestured at the tiny shop, the cold, the ink-stained walls. This is hard. This is really hard. And it's dangerous. The men who own those mills? They don't lose gracefully. Eleanor pulled off her gloves and laid them on the table. Her hands were red from the cold, the knuckles rough from laundry work, the nails short and plain. Not heiress hands anymore. I'm not running, she said. Liam picked up a rag and wiped ink from his fingers. You don't even know how to run a printing press. Then teach me. The words hung in the air between them. Outside, the wind howled off the river. Inside, the only sound was the hiss of the gas lamp and the distant clank of radiators. Liam pulled out a chair from behind the work table. It was wooden, plain, one leg slightly shorter than the others. He set it down across from the printing press. Have a seat, Miss Vancourt. Eleanor Saturday. Liam handed her a sheet of blank paper and a pencil. We start with the basics. Before you print anything, you have to know what you're saying. Every word matters. Every name matters. These women trusted you with their stories. You don't get to be careless with them. Eleanor nodded. Her pencil hovered over the paper. I'm not going to be careful, she said. I'm going to be truthful. Liam's eyes held hers. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Liam Blackwood, the son of a mill worker who died for her father's profits, did something Eleanor never expected. He smiled. I am my father's daughter, Eleanor said quietly. Now teach me how to use it for this. Liam pulled another chair close to hers. He reached for a stack of blank paper and set it between them. First lesson, he said. Ink doesn't care whose hands apply it. It only cares about pressure and angle. Watch. He took her hand, her ink-stained, laundry rough, no longer an heiress hand, and guided her fingers to the edge of the printing plate. His scars pressed against her calluses. Outside, January snow kept falling. Inside, something new began to print. April 1927 brought soft rain to New York City. It washed the winter grit from the streets and tapped gently against the windows of a small flat on the Lower East Side, where Eleanor Vancourt sat at a wooden table and held the first copy of a newspaper that didn't bear her family's name. The ink was still wet. She could smell it, sharp and clean, the way she'd come to love over the past 3 months. Her fingers carried their own stains now, proof of every late night at the printing press, every page she'd helped set, every story she'd helped tell. The newspaper was called The Worker's Voice. Not a fancy name. Not a name designed for society pages or ballroom gossip. Just a name that said exactly what it meant. On the front page, below the masthead, ran a story about the new safety regulations finally passed by the state legislature. 3 mills had already been forced to install proper guards on their looms. 2 more were under investigation. The article didn't mention Eleanor by name, but buried in the 3rd paragraph, it quoted an anonymous source who'd once lived inside the world of mill ownership and now wanted to see things change. Eleanor smiled at that. Anonymous. After everything, she'd ended up anonymous after all. Just not the way she'd expected. The flat around her had changed since October. Not dramatically. It was still small, still plain, still in a neighborhood where people counted their pennies. But a patch of spring sunlight fell across the floor. A pot of yellow flowers sat on the windowsill, a gift from Maria at the laundry. The walls held a few small prints, borrowed from the library and actually returned on time. And on a small shelf near the window, next to a pot of ink and a stack of fresh paper, sat the poison green ostrich feather fan. It was still broken. Nothing could fix the snap handle or the bent, dull feathers. But wrapped around the fracture, tied carefully in a neat bow, was a thin ribbon the color of deep red ink. The same red Eleanor used to set headlines. The same red that stained her fingers at the end of every long day. She reached out and touched it, her thumb tracing the ribbon's smooth surface. The fan had sat in a drawer for months after the ballroom. She'd almost thrown it away a dozen times. But something always stopped her. Not sentiment. Not the memory of that night. Something else. Something she hadn't understood until now. The fan had broken the moment she heard Liam's laugh. That was the night her old life ended. The night everything she thought she knew turned out to be wrong. For a long time, she'd thought of that as the worst night of her life. The night she lost everything. But you couldn't lose something that was never really yours. The sunshine. The smiles. The money that came from places she'd never questioned. None of it had been real. Not the way this was real. The ink on her fingers. The ache in her back after a long night at the press. The faces of women who called her by her first name now, not Miss Vancourt, because they'd worked beside her long enough to earn that right. Footsteps in the hallway. A familiar knock. "Come in," Eleanor said. Liam opened the door, shaking rain from his coat. He carried a stack of mail under one arm and a paper bag that smelled like fresh bread. "You're up early." "I couldn't sleep." She held up the newspaper. First run came out perfect. He took it from her, reading the front page with the focused attention he gave everything. When he finished, he looked at her with something soft in his eyes. "You wrote the 3rd paragraph." "Anonymous source, my foot. You knew I'd put myself in there. I knew you'd tell the truth." He set the paper down and pulled out a chair. "That's what makes you good at this. You can't help it." Eleanor laughed. It was a different laugh from the one she'd used in ballrooms. Rougher. Realer. Is that a compliment? It's an observation. He opened the paper bag and slid half the bread toward her. "Eat. You have a busy day." "Do I?" "Maria's organizing a meeting at her church tonight. Women from 3 different mills want to start their own newsletter. They asked for you specifically." Eleanor's chest warmed. "They asked for me." "They asked for the lady with the ink-stained hands who isn't afraid to say where her family's money came from." Liam tore off a piece of bread. "That's you, by the way. Just in case you were wondering." Outside, the rain softened to a drizzle. Sunlight pushed through the clouds, painting the room in pale gold. Eleanor looked around at her small flat, her simple furniture, her broken fan tied with red ribbon. A year ago, she would have died before living like this. A year ago, she'd thought luxury meant safety and money meant happiness. Now she knew better. Luxury was sitting at a table with someone who saw you clearly and stayed anyway. Safety was knowing you could look at your past without flinching. Happiness was ink on your fingers and work that mattered and bread shared with a friend on a rainy April morning. "There's something else," Liam said. He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. "This came to the shop. Addressed to you." Eleanor took it. Her name on the front, written in a handwriting she hadn't seen in nearly a year. Her mother's handwriting. She opened the envelope carefully. Inside, A single sheet of paper carried just a few lines. Asterisk Eleanor, asterisk. Asterisk I read what you're doing down there. The newspapers find their way uptown eventually. I don't understand it. I don't think I want to. But I remember teaching you to count your steps down staircases, and I wonder if maybe I taught you the wrong things. Asterisk. Asterisk be careful. And be warm if you can. Asterisk. Asterisk your mother. Asterisk. Eleanor read it twice. Then a third time. When she looked up, Liam was watching her with quiet attention. She's not asking you to come back, he said. No. She's not. Eleanor folded the letter and placed it on the shelf beside the fan. She's just letting me know she sees me. Is that enough? Eleanor thought about it. The mother who'd taught her to smile for cameras and never show weakness. The father who'd built an empire on other people's backs. The life she'd left behind, with all its glitter and lies. It's a start, she said finally. More than I would have gotten a year ago. Liam nodded. He understood. He always understood now. They ate their bread in comfortable silence. The rain stopped completely. Sunlight filled the room. Later that morning, Eleanor would walk to the print shop. She'd spend hours setting type and running presses and arguing with Liam about headline sizes. She'd greet Maria at the church that evening and listen to women share stories that needed telling. She'd come home tired and sore and happier than she'd ever been in her gilded childhood. But right now, in this moment, she sat at her small table and looked at the broken fan on a shelf. The poison green feathers. The snapped handle. The red ribbon binding it all together. It wasn't beautiful anymore. It wasn't worth anything. It was just a thing that had broken and been mended in a way that showed every crack. Just like her. Just like all of them. Eleanor reached out and touched the ribbon one last time. Then she stood, gathered her things, and walked out into the April sunshine to start another day of telling the truth. The fan stayed on the shelf, catching the light. And somewhere uptown, a mother read a newspaper and wondered if she'd been wrong about everything.